Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon, or Sunday night already, so Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Ooh. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Renee in Indiana, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shendor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck Guy in Ohio, Bill in Mid-Missouri, sick in Mid-Missouri. Bill, may you have a refuah shlema, complete healing. We say amen. Lorraine in Texas, Chaim in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn, Lester in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, Elise in Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 114 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. 120 pages in this tractate, so we are near now. We are near the end. Excuse me. Still on the mend, but feeling better. Thank you for everybody that davened for my refuah. For my healing. We are picking this up at the bottom of 113b, and we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in the final chapter, chapter 14. Generally talking about the continuing discussion, is one liable for offering up outside the temple? And you know, the key principle is that you're not liable for offering up something outside the holy temple unless it was fit to be brought as an offering on the altar in the courtyard of the holy temple. So if an animal never was fit to be brought on that altar, so for example, an animal that was the subject of bestiality, once it was that, if you then brought it up as an offering outside, I'm sure you've done many things wrong, starting with that animal is supposed to be put down, not used for some other weird practice. But you wouldn't be liable for offering up outside the temple because this animal was not fit to be brought as an offering on the altar, right? So that's the basic understanding here. Let's continue. Bottom of 113b. The Mishnah teaches that. Why did I mention that weird example? The Mishnah teaches that with regard to an animal that actively copulated with a person, or an animal that was the object of bestiality, or another disqualified offering, such as an animal that was designated for idolatry, or one that was worshipped, right? Either one set it aside to be given to idolatry, or somebody actually worshipped the animal as if it was a deity. If one sacrificed any of these animals outside the temple courtyard, he is exempt from having violated the written Torah law that says you can't offer up outside the holy temple. Again, that only applies to something being offered up to God, that was fit to be offered to God in the holy temple on its altar, and he brought it up outside the holy temple. And that's why you were going to say he's exempt for these animals, because they weren't fit to be brought up on the altar. And this is because, with regard to the prohibition against slaughtering outside the holy temple, the Torah states he did not bring it to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, right? So the reason he's liable for violating this particular law is because he should have brought it to the tabernacle, which is to say the place that God designated for giving offerings to God. Initially, that was the tabernacle in the wilderness. Once Joshua led the children of Israel into the Holy Land, and after the 14-year period of conquest, and then the tabernacle became situated in Shiloh, then that was the place, right? That was the place where offerings needed to be brought. That lasted for 369 years. Then the ark was captured. Then there was a period of flux, short period, where the tabernacle was situated in the priestly city of Nov. And I think the ark was in Givon. And then, not too long after that, David selected Jerusalem to be the place where the tabernacle and the ark would come together. And then eventually Solomon built the temple there. And then that was it. Forever, that would be the place where offerings had to be brought. And even after the second temple was destroyed, and we're still in that 2,000-year-long period where there is no holy temple because the Romans destroyed it and we did not merit to rebuild it yet, still no offerings may be brought anywhere that is not there in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, and there we don't bring it because there's no holy temple there, so there's no offerings being brought. But what we're talking about is a very specific question: was this prohibition violated? Okay. And that teaches that there is no liability for slaughtering outside the temple courtyard an animal that was not fit to be sacrificed in the temple courtyard. So the Gemara asks, and with regard to this too, derive from the first part of that verse to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that, as in the case of the red heifer and the scapegoat, if an animal is not fit to be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting, one is not liable for slaughtering it outside the courtyard. Now on 114a. So, granted, with regard to an animal, it's such a strange thing, right? Like all this verbiage. In Hebrew, it's much quicker, right? So, roveya venir ba, right? In other words, an animal that was either copulated with a human or it was on the receiving end of that. It's much quicker language than when we translate to English. Granted, with regard to an animal that actively copulated with a person or an animal that was the object of bestiality, you find circumstances in which the exemption of one who slaughters it outside the temple courtyard cannot be based on the fact that it is not fit to be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting. Why would that be? For example, a case where one initially consecrated it, at which point it was fit to be brought to the temple courtyard, and then someone engaged in bestiality with it. Since it was initially fit to be brought to the temple courtyard, another verse is needed to exclude it. But with regard to an animal that was set aside for idolatry, or one that was worshipped as a deity, this explanation is not tenable, since an animal that was already consecrated would not become disqualified because a person does not render forbidden an item that is not his. Right? So very interesting. So the distinction that they're making, right? If an animal had been consecrated to be brought as an offering, so it was fit. It was fit to be brought as an offering. It was a kosher animal. It wasn't blemished. It hadn't been the subject of these, disgusting practices. It was fit to be brought as an offering. It was consecrated to become an offering. Then let's look at what happens. If that animal was then used in bestiality, Okay, it becomes fully disqualified for the altar. It doesn't matter that it had a period of fitness and that it was consecrated. Now that it has been used in bestiality, it can't be offered on the altar. And therefore, if one then brought that animal as an offering outside the holy temple, he would not have violated this prohibition. What about an animal that was fit and it was consecrated to be brought as an offering, and then somebody came along and said, I hereby consecrate this animal to be used for avodah zarah, for idolatry, right? Or even the owner himself. First, he consecrated it to be an offering to God. He never got around to bringing the animal up to Jerusalem to be brought as an offering. Meanwhile, his mind became confused, or he strayed, became evil, whatever. And now he's an idolater, and he seeks to designate this animal for idolatry. Does the animal now become prohibited? No. And the reason is, once he consecrated it, it's no longer his animal. Now it belongs to heaven, so to speak. It belongs to the Holy One. It belongs to the temple that will take care of bringing that offering. Since it's no longer his, once it was consecrated, it was no longer his, he can't then designate it for idolatry, just like he can't then consecrate it for another purpose. It's already consecrated. It's not his to consecrate. And that's the same as you have a sheep, and I come along and say, I consecrate your sheep to be a gift to God, or I consecrate your sheep to be used for idolatry. Either way, it's not my sheep. I can't. My words are meaningless because I can't do that to your sheep. Now, if something is physically done with the animal, somebody comes along, it's your sheep, but somebody comes along and, commits bestiality with your sheep, okay, that sheep can no longer be used as an offering. So whether it was yours or you had consecrated it, if somebody comes along and does bestiality with it, it renders it unfit, and it can't be offered. But somebody who just comes along with words and tries to redesignate, your sheep or your consecrated sheep to some other consecration or to idolatry, those are meaningless words because they had no right to do that. So granted, with regard to an animal, right, but with regard to an animal that was set aside for idolatry or one that was worshipped, this explanation is not tenable, since an animal that was already consecrated would not become disqualified, because a person does not render forbidden an item that is not his. So the Gemara responds that it is possible to disqualify a consecrated item in the case of offerings of lesser sanctity, such as a peace offering. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, who says an offering of lesser sanctity is the property of the owner. It's interesting, right? Because now he's consecrated the animal to be a peace offering. Okay, well, that means he has to bring it up to Jerusalem and offer it as a peace offering. And it's true that after it is slaughtered and its blood is sprinkled, the meat of that offering, the edible portion of that offering, is going to belong to the owner. But is it because it remains his? I mean, the fact is it is consecrated. So what does it mean when Rabbi Yosei is saying it remains the property of him even though he consecrated it? And this is as it is taught in a Baraisa, that the verse states with regard to the obligation to bring a guilt offering for a robbery, for taking a false oath concerning unlawful possession of the property of another, where the Torah says, quote, if anyone sin and commit a trespass against the Lord and deal falsely with his neighbor in a matter of deposit or of a pledge or of robbery or have oppressed his neighbor, that's Leviticus 5:21. So the term against the Lord serves to include one who takes an oath with regard to another person's offering of lesser sanctity, since they are the property of their owner. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili. So therefore, all of the cases listed in the Mishnah are cases in which the animal was initially fit to be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting, but was subsequently disqualified as an offering. An animal that was the subject of bestiality it can be disqualified after being consecrated, right? Because even though, let's say the person who committed the bestiality is not the owner, it will still render that animal unfit. So the fact that it was fit, could have been brought on the altar, and then became unfit through this physical action, what they're asking is, now somebody offers that up, is it the same exclusion from liability that the person is exempt for then offering it up outside the holy temple because it's unfit to be brought on the altar? Is it going to be the same exclusion? Does the same exemption work for an animal that was fit and became unfit? Will the same exemption apply to an animal that never was fit? That's the main distinction here. So let's read this again. So therefore, all of the cases listed in the Mishnah are cases in which the animal was initially fit to be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting, but subsequently became disqualified as an offering. It was initially fit, and then something happened that rendered it unfit. Okay. An animal that was the subject of bestiality is disqualified after having been consecrated due to a matter of prohibited sexual intercourse. An animal that was set aside for idolatry, or one that was worshipped as a deity, becomes forbidden after it was consecrated in the case of an offering of lesser sanctity, which according to Rabbi Yosef HaGalili is still the property of its owner. Now, in the case of an animal that was given as payment to a prostitute, or as the price of a dog, or an animal born of a mixture of diverse kinds, an animal born by cesarean section, none of which could have occurred at a time when the animal was fit to be sacrificed, the Mishnah is referring to the offspring of sacrificial animals that were given as payment to a prostitute or price of a dog while in utero. These animals were fit to be brought as a sacrifice while they were still part of a consecrated animal, and only following birth are they considered to be unfit for sacrifice. Okay, so where they're going is, was there a time of fitness or not? Right, so an animal that was, a hybrid union of a sheep and a goat, okay, so that animal can't be brought as an offering, and it never had a period of fitness because as soon as it was born, it's a type of animal that can't be brought as an offering. But they're saying, well, maybe before it's born, while it's still in utero, it is fit because its mother is not a hybrid animal, right? Its mother is a sheep, let's say. So while it's still in the body of the mother, it's part of an animal that is fit to be brought. So are we going to say that this never had a time of fitness, since it did seemingly have a time of fitness while it was in utero? Although these offspring are still part of a consecrated animal while in utero, and as such one might say that the status of payment to a prostitute or the price of a dog should not take effect with regard to them, the rabbi of the Mishnah holds that with regard to the offspring of sacrificial animals, they are sanctified only as they are from the time of birth, not in utero. Therefore, they can be disqualified by serving as payment to a prostitute or the price of a dog. Right? An animal that was used to buy a dog or to pay a prostitute for her services becomes disqualified. So why would they say that those animals never had a time of fitness? They were fit before they were used in that way. That's why they're bringing up this in utero example to say, well, what if the guy made a deal with, like, this animal is pregnant and I'll give you, the baby once it's born in exchange for this puppy now, something like that. So they're going to say, well, you can't do that. It's only going to become actually an animal subject to the prohibition of, it can't be offered if it's given in exchange for a dog. It's only going to be subject to that prohibition once it's born. Now, the Mishnah cites a disagreement between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon. And actually, now we're moving on within our Mishnah, Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 14, to the next category of animals that you'd be exempt if you offered them up outside the holy temple on a private altar. You'd be exempt from violating the prohibition for offering up outside because they were not fit to be brought up on the altar in the holy temple for a new reason, right? So the reasons we've covered so far today are if the animal was used in bestiality, or if it was used for idolatry, either that it was set aside to be, sacrificed to an idol, or the animal was actually worshipped as a deity. All these things would disqualify the animal. Likewise, if it was used to hire a prostitute or in exchange for a dog, these would all be unfit for the altar, and therefore, if you sacrifice them outside the holy temple, you'd be exempt from violating this prohibition. Doesn't mean it's okay, but you'd be exempt from violating this prohibition. All right, moving on. The next category of animals is blemished animals. A blemished animal can't be brought as an offering on the altar in the courtyard of the holy temple when the holy temple is standing. So if you did bring it up outside the holy temple, a blemished animal, you would not have violated this prohibition. But there was a disagreement in our Mishnah between the majority, the rabbis, and Rabbi Shimon with respect to a blemished animal that has a temporary blemish. If it's a permanent blemish, all agree, can't be brought up on the altar. If you bring it up outside the temple, exempt from violating the prohibition for offering up outside. What about temporary blemish? The issue here is, well, if it's temporary blemish, right now it can't be brought up on the altar in the temple. But once the animal is healed of this blemish, it would go back to being a fit animal that could be brought up on the altar. And therefore, if you brought it up outside the holy temple, you would be liable for violating this prohibition. Why do they disagree on it? Let's see. So the Mishnah cites a disagreement between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon with regard to temporarily blemished animals. Rabbi Shimon holds that one who sacrifices them outside the temple courtyard violates a prohibition, as they will be fit for sacrifice after the passage of time, whereas the rabbis hold that one is exempt because right now it's blemished. So the Mishnah cites two similar disagreements. With regard to doves whose time of fitness has not yet arrived, right, because they're not old enough, time of fitness has not yet arrived, and that are slaughtered outside the temple courtyard, and with regard to one who slaughters an animal itself and its offspring on one day, where the latter, the offspring, which is not fit to be sacrificed until the next day, is slaughtered outside the temple courtyard, right? So that's the law that you cannot bring a mother sheep and its offspring, assuming that the offspring is old enough and otherwise qualified. You can't bring them up both as sacrifices on the same day. The offspring could be brought up the next day, but you can't bring them up on the same day. So the first one, there's no problem there. So that is fit to be brought up. But it's offspring on the same day. So what they're saying is if you took the offspring and offered it up on an external altar, outside the holy temple, you would not have violated the prohibition on offering up outside the temple because that offspring on that particular day could not have been brought up on the altar inside the temple. Now the Gemara comments, and all of these cases are necessary, as if the Mishnah had taught the disagreement only in the case of temporarily blemished animals, one would think that the rabbis deem exempt one who sacrifices outside the temple courtyard only in the case of blemished animals because they are repulsive. But with regard to doves whose time of fitness has not yet arrived, which are not repulsive and which will be fit when their time comes, I will say that this is not the law, and that the rabbis concede to Rabbi Shimon that one does violate a prohibition. That's why it needed to be said, because that's not the case. And if the Mishnah had taught the disagreement only in the case of doves whose time of fitness has not yet arrived, one could say that it is only in this case that Rabbi Shimon holds that one who sacrifices them outside violates a prohibition, because they are not defined as fit for sacrifice and rejected. Their time of fitness simply has not yet arrived. But with regard to temporarily blemished animals, which were fit for sacrifice and then became disqualified by their blemish, I will say that this is not the law, as Rabbi Shimon would concede to the rabbis that one sacrifices from outside the temple courtyard, that one who sacrifices them outside the temple courtyard does not violate a prohibition, since they are not fit to be sacrificed as offerings. That's not the case. That's why it needed to be said. And if the Mishnah had taught only these two cases, temporarily blemished animals and doves whose time of fitness has not yet arrived, I would say that the rabbis hold that one who slaughters them outside the temple courtyard is not liable because their disqualification is inherent. But in the case of the animal itself and its offspring, where there's no disqualification inherent to the animal, right? There's nothing wrong with the mother sheep, and there's nothing wrong with the offspring sheep. It's just that because they have that relationship, they can't both be sacrificed in the same day. But the offspring could be sacrificed the next day. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the animal. But in the case of the animal itself and its offspring, where the disqualification comes to the offspring from an external factor, i.e. that its parent was slaughtered that day, I would say that the rabbis concede to Rabbi Shimon that one who slaughters an animal and its offspring outside the temple courtyard does violate the prohibition. Therefore, it is necessary for the Mishnah to teach the disagreement in each case, right? In each of these cases, Rabbi Shimon would say, since the animal will become fit at some other time, one who sacrifices it now is liable for offering up outside, but the rabbis who overrule Rabbi Shimon, the majority, say, well, right now, it can't be offered up on the altar inside the temple, so if somebody offered it up outside, he's exempt for offering up outside. Okay, next topic. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Shimon says, in the case of any sacrificial animal that is fit to be sacrificed after the passage of time, if one sacrificed it outside the courtyard, he is in violation of a prohibition, but there is no liability for chorus. Rabbi Shimon did not specify what prohibition is violated. So the Gemara therefore asks, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Shimon in these cases, right? So he's saying, no, you did do something wrong because this animal that, it's granted right now, it can't be offered up on the altar, but it will return to fitness in the future. Therefore, if you offered it up outside the holy temple now, you have violated a prohibition. But what prohibition? The prohibition we've been talking about is the Torah prohibition that if you offer up something that's fit for the altar, you do it outside the altar, you're liable. And the liability means that you're liable to charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court. Now the Mishnah is saying that Rabbi Shimon says you're liable for violating a prohibition, but it's not the charis bearing prohibition. Okay, so what prohibition is it? Rabbi Ilya says that Reish Lakish says that the verse states, you shall not do all that we do here this day, every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes, for you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God gives you. Deuteronomy 12, verses 8 and 9. Right, so from this is we learned that you're only going to become liable for offering up outside, your individual offerings, if it is once the Jewish people have come at rest in the Holy Land, meaning the wars of conquest are over, and there is a designated place, it would be Shiloh and later Jerusalem, where the offerings are supposed to be brought, and if you don't bring them there, and you don't bring them in the courtyard of the Holy Temple, then you're guilty of violating this prohibition. Okay? So Moses said the following to the Jewish people. When you enter the land of Israel, upright offerings, i.e. offerings that one believes are proper to bring due to one's own generosity. So these would be voluntary offerings, such as vow offerings, gift offerings, peace offerings, and thanks offerings. These you may sacrifice on your own altars. But obligatory offerings you may not sacrifice, even in the tabernacle in Gilgal, until you arrive at the period of rest, which would then become the tabernacle at Shiloh, at which point you may sacrifice them. So I wonder if that means that during that period, when it came to obligatory individual offerings, like sin offerings, maybe they didn't bring any for the 14 years during the wars of conquest until they reestablished the national altar at Shiloh. And since obligatory offerings during the period of Gilgal, so that means when Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land during those 14 years, the tabernacle was at Gilgal before it was moved to Shiloh, right? So Gilgal means the 14 years during the wars of conquest when private altars were permitted. So since obligatory offerings during the period of Gilgal, in relation to the period of Shiloh, are considered offerings whose time has not yet arrived, so maybe like, it's not that you were excused from bringing the sin offerings, but you had to wait until the 14 years were over and then bring them at Shiloh. So those offerings, their time has not yet arrived. And Moses said to the Jewish people concerning them, you shall not do during that period. It follows that one who sacrifices an offering whose time has not yet arrived is in violation of the prohibition, you shall not do. Right? So what they're doing now is they're saying there's two separate prohibitions. One is you shall not offer up outside the temple. You shall not slaughter outside the temple. Right? Those are different because there's slaughtering is its own prohibition and offering up is its own prohibition. Okay. But now they're saying there's a third prohibition that could be involved. The third is you shall not do what is right in your own eyes, right? Just because you want to bring an offering, if you think that you are not permitted to bring up sin offerings during that period when there is no national altar, you'll have to wait till there is a national altar. That's why right now there is no national altar, and therefore we can't bring sin offerings. And somebody who did bring a sin offering would be violating a prohibition. What prohibition? You shall not do what is right in your own eyes. You shall only do what is according to Torah, what is right in the eyes of the Lord. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zerah, therefore it is prohibited to sacrifice offerings whose time has not yet arrived, even if they are sacrificed in the tabernacle, as was the case in Gilgal. If so, anyone who sacrifices an offering whose time has not yet arrived, even if he sacrifices it in the temple courtyard, should also receive lashes for sacrificing it, just as one would for violating other Torah prohibitions. Right? So there are kares-bearing prohibitions. Lower level than that is just a thou shalt not. That doesn't bear, a death penalty, neither at the hands of the earthly court nor a heavenly court. There's a lot of thou shalt nots. If you violate a thou shalt not intentionally, and you were warned not to do it and you did it anyway, the punishment would be flogging. So it lashes. So that's what they're saying here. So why did Rabbi Zerah say elsewhere that one who slaughters inside the temple courtyard an offering whose time has not yet arrived does not receive lashes for having violated the prohibition of it shall not be accepted in Leviticus 22, which is the general prohibition against sacrificing animals that are not fit to be sacrificed. So Rabbi Zerah explains that he does not receive lashes because the verse has transmuted the negative precept into a prohibition that is stated as a positive commandment. In the verse, but from the 8th day forward, it may be accepted. There is no punishment of lashes for violating a positive commandment. Lashes are for violating a negative commandment. Positive, thou shalt do such and such. Negative commandment, thou shalt not do such and such. Lashes are for violating negative commandments intentionally. But for violating a positive commandment, omitting to do, neglecting to do that which was commanded, the punishment is not lashes, generally speaking, because if you fail to do something that you were supposed to do, the remedy for that is to do it. Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking that one should receive lashes for having... Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking that one should still receive lashes for having violated the prohibition of you shall not do. Specifically, you shall not do what is right in your own eyes. So the Gemara responds, that statement of Rabbi Zera applies only according to the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah and hold that the verse that states, you shall not do what is right in your own eyes, does not indicate that one who slaughters an animal whose time has not yet arrived is in violation of a prohibition. But according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, one would indeed receive lashes for slaughtering an animal whose time has not yet arrived inside the temple. The lashes would apply, but only according to the minority opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, Rabbi Zera's statement is even in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who also holds that one would not receive lashes for slaughtering inside the temple courtyard, an offering whose time has not yet arrived. A prohibition cannot be derived from the prohibition stated with regard to the tabernacle in Gilgal, since inside the tabernacle in Gilgal, in relation to the tabernacle in Shiloh, in other words, according to this, slaughtering at the tabernacle in Gilgal, relative to the tabernacle when it came to Shiloh, when there was a national altar, slaughtering obligatory offerings at Gilgal, which was not supposed to be done, is like offering up outside, right? Because you're not supposed to bring these offerings to Gilgal. You're not supposed to bring them up at all, not until the nation is at rest after the wars of conquest. Again, we're speaking about a specific time in Jewish history, the first 14 years after Joshua led the children of Israel into the Holy Land. Since the Torah had said, you won't bring these offerings until you are at rest, and the Lord shall have designated a place, through his prophet to let you know where the offerings would be brought. So somebody who did what is right in his own eyes and brought it before the national altar was ready, that would be like offering up outside, according to Rabbi Shimon. Now, Rabbah said the reason of Rabbi Shimon is not based on the prohibition, you shall not do what is right in your own eyes, as Reish Lakish claims, but rather upon a different verse. As it is taught in Baraisa, the Rabbi Shimon says, from where is it derived that one who slaughters his Pesach on a private altar, right, the Paschal lamb, the Pesach, the Passover offering, from where is it derived that one who slaughters his Pesach on a private altar at a time when it is prohibited to sacrifice offerings on private altars violates a prohibition? Obviously, he's violating a prohibition, but which prohibition is it? The verse states, you may not sacrifice the Pesach within any of your gates, but rather at the place that the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell, there you shall sacrifice the Pesach. That's Deuteronomy 16, verse 5. Now, one might have thought that even at a time when it is permitted to sacrifice offerings on private altars, this is so. Therefore, the verse states, within any be'achad of your gates, which indicates that I said this prohibition to you only when all the Jewish people enter the temple through one gate, echad, in order to sacrifice their offerings. When there is no permanent communal altar, it is permitted to slaughter the Pesach on a private altar. Is that true? Let's just read the law quickly. The Pesach may be slaughtered only in the temple courtyard like other offerings. Even during the period when private altars were permitted, the Pesach is not sacrificed on a private altar, and whoever sacrifices it there is liable to receive lashes. This is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon in the Baraisa. Right? So it just sounded like he said the opposite. That's why Rab is going to analyze this Baraisa. When was this Pesach for which one violates a prohibition for slaughtering it during a time when it is forbidden to sacrifice on private altars slaughtered? If we say that it was after midday on the 14th of Nisan, which is the proper time for sacrificing the Pesach in the temple, then one who sacrifices it violates not only a prohibition, he should also be deemed liable to receive charis as well, as would anyone who slaughters a fit offering outside the temple courtyard. Rather, is it not discussing one who slaughtered the Pesach on a private altar on the 14th of Nisan before midday, or any other time of the year, right? Which is not during its time. When is the time to slaughter a Pesach? On the afternoon before Pesach begins that night. In Jerusalem, in the courtyard of the Holy Temple. Okay, well, what if somebody slaughtered a lamb designated to be a Pesach in the Holy Temple before that afternoon, before midday? Okay, so he violated a prohibition because he sacrificed it before its time. What if he sacrificed that outside the Holy Temple? Right, so a Pesach not during its time, we might say he's exempt because it was not fit to be brought to be slaughtered in the courtyard of the temple. Let's see. Now the Gemara says, actually the Pesach may have been sacrificed on a private altar on the afternoon of Nisan, and it is referring to a time when it is permitted to sacrifice on private altars, i.e. the periods of Gilgal, Nov, and Givon. The verse teaches that although it was permitted to sacrifice voluntary vow offerings and gift offerings on private altars, the Pesach may be sacrificed only on a great public altar. So therefore, if someone sacrificed it outside the Holy Temple, even when private altars are permitted, he would be liable for offering up outside. Now the Gemara asks, but doesn't the Baraisa state at a time when it is prohibited to sacrifice on private altars? And the Gemara responds, the Baraisa means that it is prohibited for one to sacrifice the Pesach on a private altar, but it is permitted to use a private altar for another offering, like a voluntary offering or a gift offering. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Okay, the Mishna teaches that with regard to an offering whose time has not yet arrived because it is premature for its owner, one who sacrifices it outside the temple courtyard is exempt, right? Back to our basic principle. If you can't bring it up on the altar, then if you bring it up outside the Holy Temple, you're exempt from violating do not offer up outside the Holy Temple. Right? So the Mishnah taught that with regard to an offering whose time has not yet arrived because it is premature for its owner, one who sacrifices it outside the temple courtyard is exempt. Right? So the last case was animals that can't be offered up inside because they're blemished, even if temporarily, or because they were, used for something else, bestiality, idolatry, etc., or if they were just too young, right? A dove who is not aged enough so that its offering can be brought. Okay, now what about if the owner's time has not yet come? So for example, if you're going to bring up, if you're a Nazir, right? A Nazir, somebody who takes a vow of Nazir, is to abstain from products of the grapevine, and not to cut his hair, and not to become impure for the dead. And he took that vow for a specific amount of time, let's say for 30 days. Right? That was a standard length of a Naziris vow. So at the conclusion of his Naziris, so that he can become permitted to drink wine again, he has to bring a group of offerings. One of them is a sin offering. When can he bring a sin offering? Only after the 30 days of Naziris is over. If he tries to bring if he brings his sin offering on a private altar outside the Holy Temple, is he liable for offering up outside? No, because his offering, even though the animal was fit, there was no problem with that animal. It could be used as a sin offering, but since it's been designated to be his sin offering, the sin offering of a Nazir who's completed his Naziris, and he has not yet completed his Naziris, therefore, if it was brought up outside the temple, it would not be fit to be brought up inside the temple, and therefore he'd be exempt from liability for offering up outside. right? The Mishnah taught that with regard to an offering whose time has not yet arrived because it is premature for its owner, one who sacrifices it outside the temple courtyard is exempt. This category includes a zav, a zava, a woman after childbirth, any of whom sacrificed a sin offering or guilt offering outside the temple courtyard during the days that they are counting toward purification. And the Gemara asks, and are these individuals subject to the obligation to bring guilt offerings? Zeri said the text of the Mishnah should teach also the mitzorah together with the zav, the zava, and a woman after childbirth. A mitzorah brings a guilt offering as part of his purification process. And the Mishnah also teaches that if those whose time has not yet arrived sacrifice their burnt offerings or their peace offerings outside the temple courtyard, they are liable, right? Because these offerings could be brought at any time. They're in addition to the purification process, which involves obligatory offerings. And the Gemara asks, and are these individuals subject to the obligation to bring peace offerings? And Rav Sheshes said, teach the case of a Nazir as part of the list in the Mishnah. A Nazir brings a peace offering at the conclusion of his term of Naziris. And the Gemara notes that the addition of Zeri to the text of the Mishnah, i.e. the case of the Mitzorah, was fixed by the Tanaim in the version of the Mishnah that they would teach, while the addition of Rav Sheshes, i.e. the case of the Nazir, was not fixed by the Tanaim in the Mishnah that they would teach. So that was a later detail. The teaching is still valid, whether it became fully incorporated at the level of a Mishnah or not, or it was added at the level of the Gemara. Again, when we read these teachings, right, whether in the Mishnah or in the Gemara, which is a commentary on the Mishnah, the initial commentary, we should keep in mind the reason that we have this saying, we don't paskin halacha from the Gemara, we don't paskin halacha from the Talmud, we don't paskin halacha, right? So in other words, we read laws and it sounds like, oh, this is permitted or this is prohibited. And then we might later learn out, well, the way the law ended up is the opposite of what we just read. How is that possible? Because what is the structure of the Talmud? It records discussions, it records debates. And sometimes a debate includes the very confident ruling of one sage, but which comes into conflict with the very confident ruling of another sage. One says it's permitted, one says it's prohibited. Right? So how do we know where the law ended up? Sometimes it ends up, a ruling is given elsewhere in the Talmud that takes into account we had those two rulings and we decided such and such. Sometimes the law ends up getting decided by something else, that generally speaking, when Rabbi Akiva has an argument with one other sage, we follow Rabbi Akiva. But when Rabbi Akiva is up against the majority, we follow the majority. Or when we have an anonymous ruling in a Mishnah, that tends to be the law, but it might contradict something else, another anonymous ruling in a Mishnah somewhere else. That's why we follow a code like Shulchan Aruch, kind of later compilation of exactly where did the law end up, taking into account all of the Talmud and all the debates that are contained in the Talmud. And that's why when we want to know, whether a pot became unkoshered so that we can no longer eat from it, we look up, we ask our local Orthodox rabbi, or in a pinch, we look it up in Shulchan Aruch ourselves, but we don't just look at a relevant passage in the Talmud, because that's not usually the last word on what is the law and what is not. Okay. One question from Sharon. Is the language of everyone did what was right in their own eyes being used intentionally as a negative, as it was a term used with some repetition in the book of Judges, as well as at the start of the book of Ruth, about events at the time of the Judges, to indicate the lack of clearly defined what was right and wrong? Yes. Or rather, in those other books, right, in Judges and in Ruth, they were referring back to the Torah, right? Because this is, from Deuteronomy, when Moses is, giving the final charge to the Jewish people and saying, right now you're filled with holy fire. You want to do the right thing. We've all been through a lot together. You saw your brethren dropped dead in the wilderness because they freaked out in the sin of the spies, or you saw your brethren drop dead in the wilderness because they challenged Hashem and were angry at Hashem for or they had a lack of faith in Hashem. Okay, so by the end of the period in the wilderness, the people were ready to go into the Holy Land to begin living their lives as Torah Jews, and they were excited to do it, right? But Judaism is not do what feels right, right? Even do what feels right according to your sense of what the Torah says. That's why it's always been, right, that on questions that are difficult, you will look to your elders, your sages, your prophets, your judges, eventually the rabbis, who are masters of the tradition, to enlighten you what exactly is the law. And it is definitely stated as a negative, every man shall do what is right in his own eyes. That's not good, right? You have to do what is right according to Jewish law. And you should be inspired by it and learn from it and come seek an understanding of the spiritual component of all these laws. It's not that we're raising generations of blind sheep, sheep that follow blindly. Doesn't matter. There's definitely submitting to God's will and putting aside ego. Of course, that's part of faith and rising up. But it is definitely considered a negative. Every man doing what is right in his own eyes. And when when we as individuals have a problem and say that I don't believe in that halakha, that there's something wrong with that, where it's accepted norm of Jewish practice. So that's where a Jew has to say, okay, well, why does this feel wrong to me? I need to learn more, because if it is halakha, then it's right? Then it's right. Then it is God's will refracted, through history and through the lens of our sages who spent, as we see, centuries figuring out exactly what God's will is for us. And sometimes it's tough. Sometimes, especially, the vicissitudes and fashions, of history change so much from era to era, and things seem old-fashioned to us. But very often, something that feels wrong in one era, eventually they learn, oh, well, you know what, we didn't know so much in that era, and, our ancestors were right all along. So, and there's going to be even times when, it just doesn't feel right to me. Okay, it's not going to feel right to me, but if it is, Jewish law, then I'm going to follow it anyway. So as Sharon correctly points out, the idea, each man doing what is right in his own eyes, that's not how Jewish law works. And when people do that, right, and just say, well, no, we know better than halacha, we know better than what our family, our Jewish family has been doing for thousands of years, we're going to rewrite it, right? And we're going to come up with our own version of Judaism. Sounds good, sounds nice, won't last, won't work, and so movements, that abolish parts of Jewish law don't last. And we're already seeing that, and that's a conversation for another day. But that is not how Jewish law works. And they're making that point from the beginning. It's absolutely, like you say, it's in the Torah, this idea that each doing what is right in his own eyes is prohibited and won't work. Have faith in God, have faith in the Torah, and have faith in the process that God put into motion with the oral law at Mount Sinai from the very beginning, when it was given to Moses at Mount Sinai, that there would be a process for answering questions that come up, in new eras, when there's new technologies and new history and new stuff going on that requires answers that aren't explicit in the Torah. There would be a process involving this whole tradition of our sages, our elders, discussion, and how to come up with an answer. And then, once our leaders have come up with that answer, the rest of us understand that's the law and we follow the law. Very similar to the social contract of living in a country. You may not agree with every law, but you're going to follow the law if you're going to live in that country. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday, at the regular Monday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great